The Case. A loud, startling noise cut through Linda's dream, jolting her awake. Noises always seemed so much louder when they woke you up, like someone was yanking you back to consciousness with a painful force. The noise was a man's voice over the subway car's speaker, and Linda had only caught the end of it. Nth Street. 27th Street, she assumed. At least she hoped the man had said 20. Her stop was 31st Street. Linda squinted, blinking, trying to clear her vision. How long had she been asleep? She had worried about this happening, as she was exhausted from the long visit with her friend Mandy, who lived miles away. They had stayed up late, too late, watching movies. Linda checked her phone. Now it was almost 2 a.m. It was then that Linda fixated on the two passengers sitting just across from her. It was a middle-aged man sitting with whom Linda guessed was his son, who looked to be around the age of 6 or 7. He was leaning against his father's side, apparently sleeping. The three of them were the only ones in the subway car. The father looked at Linda just as she looked at him. How did it always seem to happen that way? Sorry, Linda said with a smirk of embarrassment. What street was that? The man smiled back. 27th, he replied. It was then that Linda wondered how long the man and his son had been there. Had she been snoring? Had she been leaning back with her mouth hanging wide open? She would never know, and that's what made it worse. The man's son opened his eyes and slowly blinked. How much longer? The boy murmured, looking up at his father. Not much, his father replied. The boy then looked at Linda. He stared at her, as if he had in fact possibly seen her in some embarrassing pose as she was sleeping, before he himself had dozed off. Hi, Linda said with a smile, not knowing what else to do to break the intensifying awkwardness of the silent stare. Hi, was his quiet, murmured response. Linda then noticed what looked like a very large, long, maroon-colored briefcase lying under the seat of the father and his son, which had slid out just a bit. When Linda looked at it, so did the young boy. He stared at it. It's okay, Danny, his father said. There's nothing to be afraid of, remember? Little Danny nodded timidly, yet still seeming troubled by the case. The man looked at Linda again with a smile. I'm a ventriloquist, he said. Oh, nice, Linda replied, hoping her response hadn't sounded as disinterested as she really was. She was tired and just wanted to get home. She wasn't one for small talk. 28th Street, announced the voice on the speaker overhead. This was going to feel like forever. Danny was still staring at the case. He didn't look very happy. He didn't look well, either. His face was pale, with a blank expression. He looked ill. After several seconds, he looked away at the window behind Linda, as though trying to avoid the case. Was it the case? Was it really troubling him that much? He hates that thing, his father said, looking at Linda. It creeps him out. Danny looked back down at the case, pressing against his father anxiously. Danny, his father said, I told you, there's nothing to be afraid of. Danny's father leaned down to look at the case, then kicked it back under their seat the rest of the way. See, he said, just a box. It's not going to hurt you. The father looked back at Linda. We're coming back from a show we did earlier tonight in the city, he said. Danny here is my little assistant, even though he's still getting used to it. He paused. Like I said, he gets a little creeped out. I don't like going to those shows with you, Danny mumbled, looking back up at his father. I know, son, but it's like I told you, there's nothing to be afraid of. Don't worry, you'll get used to it, I promise. Linda looked at the case. Now she herself was getting a little creeped out. She assumed it was because of her childhood fear of large dolls, which briefly crept up into adulthood every now and then. "You know," Linda said, looking at Danny, "when I was your age, I was afraid of dolls too." Danny looked at her innocently. "But not anymore?" he murmured. "Nope," Linda replied with a smile, even though she knew that was technically a lie. "Are you still afraid of things?" Danny inquired timidly. Linda paused. "Yeah, I am," she said. "Sometimes I get a little scared of the dark." Danny's eyes widened, and he sat up a bit taller, as though Linda had really caught his attention. "Me too," he murmured, a bit louder, but still shyly. "I hate the dark," he mumbled. "It scares me really bad. And that—" He broke off as he looked down at the floor, where the front end of the case was no longer visible from his view. Danny's father put his arm around him and gave him a few reassuring squeezes. Danny leaned against him once again. "But I'm not afraid of the dark anymore," Linda went on. "After I started getting older, I knew there was nothing to be afraid of." "See?" Danny's father said, looking down at him. "You'll get braver. You won't be afraid of the dark anymore, or that silly old thing." He smiled and tousled Danny's hair. Danny closed his eyes. He looked as though he wanted to get off this train just as much as Linda did. 29th Street, came the voice as the train began to slow to a halt. Danny's father suddenly stood up, picking up sleepy Danny in his arms. "That's us," he said. He flashed Linda a brief smile before quickly heading across the subway car and stepping out the doors to her left. He seemed to be in a hurry, probably to get Danny to bed. After all, it was past 2:00. Before the doors closed, a police officer stepped into the subway car, looked around, then stepped out, appearing as though maybe he had gone to the wrong place and had realized it. After he left and the doors began to close, Linda saw the large maroon ventriloquist case still lying under the seat opposite of her. The man had been holding his son and completely forgotten it. Linda jumped up and rushed over to the case, reaching down and grabbing it by the handle, hoping she could make it to the doors in time to maybe shout out to the police officer to take it and give it to the man who had previously gotten off the train with his son. As she pulled it out from under the seat and started to head for the doors, its lid fell open, as apparently it hadn't been locked. Linda looked down and stared. The doors closed, and the train began moving again. Linda just stood there, staring down at what was in that case. Nothing. Nothing but a small photograph. She picked it up. It was a photo of Danny, smiling, looking much more cheerful and full of life. Written on the back of the photo were the dates 2006 to 2013.